In the late afternoon, the fading sunset cast its soft glow over the towering buildings in a small neighborhood in downtown Chicago. Inside a modest third-floor apartment, Amanda, a young pregnant woman, leaned against the living room wall. She was panting, sweat streaming down her face, as waves of intense contractions rippled through her body. "Jake!" Amanda called out weakly but with an unmistakable tone of urgency. Her husband, Jake, rushed out of the kitchen, where he had been preparing dinner, immediately abandoning what he was doing upon hearing her voice. "I'm here. What's wrong?" Jake asked. His blue eyes filled with worry as he saw Amanda's pained expression. "The pain. I think it's time," Amanda said, gripping the edge of the sofa for support. Jake instantly understood. This was the moment they had been both anticipating and dreading for the past 9 months. Without hesitation, he dashed to the phone and called for an ambulance. "We need an ambulance right away. My wife is in labor, and her contractions are extremely strong," Jake said, his eyes never leaving Amanda. The dispatcher instructed Jake to stay calm and help Amanda breathe steadily while waiting for the ambulance. Jake hurried back to her side, taking her hand gently. "Breathe deeply, Amanda. The ambulance is on its way." Amanda nodded, trying to follow his guidance. But each contraction brought unbearable pain. She squeezed Jake's hand tightly, drawing strength from the concern and determination she saw in his eyes. A few minutes later, the sound of an ambulance siren echoed in the distance. Jake rushed to open the door as the flashing red lights appeared below. 2 paramedics, Frank and Lucy, quickly climbed the stairs and entered the apartment. "We're the ambulance team. Amanda, how are you feeling?" Frank asked, quickly assessing her condition. "She's in a lot of pain, and the contractions are constant," Jake answered on his wife's behalf, his voice filled with urgency. Frank and Lucy carefully helped Amanda onto a stretcher, moving her gently but efficiently. Jake stayed close by, his eyes never leaving his wife. His heart was heavy with worry, but he knew he had to stay strong for Amanda. The ambulance sped through Chicago's busy streets, lights flashing and sirens wailing to signal other vehicles to clear the way. Frank sat beside Amanda, his hand on her wrist to monitor her pulse. Lucy, seated in the front, maintained constant communication with the hospital to ensure they were ready upon arrival. "Hang in there, Amanda. We're just a few minutes away," Frank said, his voice calm yet encouraging. Amanda tried to focus on her breathing as tears streamed down her face, the pain growing more intense with each contraction. Jake sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. Though fear gripped him, he didn't let it show, determined to stay composed for her. As the ambulance approached the hospital, it suddenly came to an abrupt halt. A police car blocked the road, its lights flashing, forcing the ambulance to stop. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice full of concern as he noticed the ambulance wasn't moving forward. Frank glanced out the front window, his brows furrowed as he saw the police car parked across the road. "I'm not sure. Let me check," Frank said, opening the ambulance door and stepping out. The officer, whose name tag read Thompson, stepped out of his car and approached. Frank tried to keep his tone calm. "We're an ambulance with a patient in labor. Please let us pass." Thompson frowned, his expression cold as he looked at Frank. "I saw you run a red light back there. Even ambulances have to follow traffic laws," he said firmly. Frank was taken aback by the officer's response. "But we're responding to an emergency. Our patient needs to get to the hospital immediately," he explained urgently. Thompson crossed his arms over his chest, his tone unyielding. "Rules are rules. I need to see the vehicle's paperwork." Jake couldn't take it any longer as he saw Amanda writhing in pain in the ambulance. He opened the door and stepped out, striding toward the police officer. "What are you doing? My wife needs to get to the hospital immediately," Jake shouted, his voice filled with rage. Thompson turned to face Jake, his expression growing even colder. "You're obstructing a law enforcement officer. Get back in the vehicle, or I'll arrest you for interference," Thompson threatened. Jake stared at the officer, his anger boiling over. "Obstruction? You're the one obstructing a life-saving mission. My wife and unborn child are in danger," Jake shouted, his voice breaking with fury. Frank stepped in, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder to pull him back. "Jake, calm down. We need to stay composed." Turning to Thompson, he pleaded, "Please, officer, this is an emergency. Let us pass." But Thompson remained unmoved. "Show me the vehicle's paperwork, or you're not going anywhere," he said, his tone rigid and unyielding. Meanwhile, Amanda lay on the stretcher, her breathing becoming more labored. She could hear the argument outside and felt her fear intensify. Each contraction felt like it was tearing her apart, and tears streamed down her face. Lucy turned to Amanda, trying to keep her voice gentle. "Amanda, keep breathing steadily. We'll get you to the hospital as soon as we can." Amanda nodded weakly, but her heart was gripped with worry. She wasn't sure if they would make it to the hospital in time, and the tension of the situation only amplified her pain. Thompson glared at Frank and Jake, showing no trace of understanding or compassion. The standoff dragged on, each passing minute making Amanda's hope feel more fragile. Jake couldn't stand it any longer as he watched Amanda writhing in pain. Clenching his fists, he locked eyes with Thompson, his gaze burning with fury. "My wife is in labor, and she needs help," Jake shouted, his voice breaking with urgency. His eyes were filled with desperation, an overwhelming sense of helplessness taking over as he saw Amanda enduring the agony he couldn't alleviate. Thompson smirked coldly, his expression icy. "Rules are rules. If you obstruct me any further, I'll arrest you immediately," he said, his tone rigid and devoid of sympathy. Jake stepped closer, ignoring the threat. He pointed a trembling finger at Thompson, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "Do you understand my wife could die because of this? She and my baby are in danger." Thompson remained unmoved, his gaze growing even colder. "I warned you," he said, placing a hand on the baton at his waist, emphasizing his authority. Frank quickly stepped in, grabbing Jake and trying to de-escalate the situation. "Jake, calm down. Don't do anything that'll make this worse," Frank said quietly, his eyes darting nervously between Jake and the officer. Inside the ambulance, Amanda lay on the stretcher, her body drenched in sweat as each contraction threatened to overwhelm her. She could hear the argument outside but was powerless to do anything. Clutching the edges of the stretcher tightly, she struggled to remain calm, though she felt her strength slipping away with every passing moment. Lucy placed a comforting hand on Amanda's shoulder, her voice steady and encouraging. "Amanda, stay with me. Focus on your breathing. You're doing great, and we'll get you to the hospital soon." But Amanda's eyes betrayed her growing fear and anxiety. She knew every minute that passed increased the risk for her and the baby. She couldn't stop the tears from streaming down her face as a wave of helplessness consumed her, overshadowing all other thoughts. The argument showed no signs of stopping, and the tension grew heavier with every passing moment. Suddenly, Thompson, his face emotionless, acted. He struck Frank hard on the shoulder as Frank stepped forward to intervene. Frank stumbled backward, crashing into the ambulance door, leaving everyone present stunned. "What the hell are you doing?" Jake shouted, his voice breaking with horror and rage. "You have no right to do that." Thompson locked eyes with Jake, his expression still devoid of emotion. "I have the authority to stop anyone interfering with my duties," he said, gripping his baton tightly. Frank slowly sat up, clutching his aching shoulder. He glared at Thompson, his eyes filled with disdain, though he fought to remain calm. "What are you doing? This is a medical emergency. You have no right to obstruct us like this." Thompson didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand, signaling for Frank to be silent. "This is my final warning. If anyone else interferes, I will make arrests immediately." Jake couldn't contain his anger any longer. He stepped forward. But before he could say anything, Lucy's voice called out from the ambulance. "Jake, Amanda needs you. Don't make this worse." Jake turned back toward the ambulance, his eyes meeting Amanda's. She lay on the stretcher, her weak hand reaching out, her tear-filled eyes silently pleading with him. "Jake, don't. I need you," Amanda whispered, her voice faint but urgent. Jake felt his heart tighten as if being crushed. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down, stepping back. His hands trembled as he gripped the ambulance door. "Fine. I won't do anything, but I'm begging you. Let us go," Jake said, his voice breaking. Jake stood at the ambulance door, staring directly at Thompson with bloodshot eyes. He knew he couldn't change Thompson's decision, but he also couldn't just stand by and watch his wife suffer in pain. "Listen to me. If you don't let us go, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you pay for this," Jake said, his voice trembling but resolute. Thompson raised an eyebrow and sneered. "Are you threatening me?" He stepped closer to Jake, his gaze sharp and challenging. "You should know I have the authority to arrest you right now for obstructing a law enforcement officer." Jake didn't respond, his eyes locked onto Thompson's. He wasn't afraid. There was nothing left to fear except losing his wife and child. Frank stepped forward, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder, trying to pull him back. "Jake, we need to stay calm. If we can't do anything to change this, then at least don't make it worse. Amanda needs us, and she needs you to be here," Frank said, his voice gentle but firm. Jake looked into Frank's eyes, then back at Amanda, who lay in the ambulance. She was in agony, her labored breathing squeezing his heart with every painful gasp. Taking a deep breath, Jake slowly stepped back, his gaze never leaving Thompson's. As the situation grew increasingly tense, the sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. 2 additional police cars arrived at the scene, their lights flashing as they pulled up behind Thompson's vehicle. Captain Morales stepped out, his expression serious and focused. Morales approached Thompson, his eyes scanning the scene. He saw Jake standing at the ambulance door, his face filled with anger and desperation. Frank was holding his shoulder, clearly injured, while Officer Thompson stood rigidly in front of the ambulance, blocking its path. "What's going on here?" Morales asked, his voice clear and commanding, his gaze fixed on Thompson, demanding an explanation. Thompson straightened, his tone remaining cold and detached. "I saw this ambulance run a red light, and I'm requesting their paperwork. They're being uncooperative and obstructive." Morales looked at Thompson, then at Frank and Jake. It was immediately clear that the situation wasn't as straightforward as Thompson claimed. Turning back to Thompson, Morales spoke firmly. "You're obstructing an ambulance carrying a woman in labor? This is a medical emergency." Jake stepped forward, his voice shaking with both pain and fury. "My wife is in labor, and we need to get to the hospital immediately. Not only is he obstructing us, but he also attacked the paramedic." Morales fixed his gaze on Thompson, his displeasure evident. "Thompson, you have no authority to do this. Let them go immediately." Thompson frowned, reluctant to comply. But seeing Morales's resolute expression and noticing the surrounding bystanders recording the incident, he had no choice. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, clearing the way for the ambulance. Morales turned to Frank and Jake, his tone softening. "I apologize for this incident. Please get her to the hospital as quickly as possible." Frank nodded, quickly returning to the ambulance. Jake climbed in as well, holding Amanda's hand tightly. "We're on our way to the hospital now. Sweetheart, everything's going to be okay," Jake said, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his exhausted and pained wife. The ambulance began to move again, this time unimpeded. The sirens wailed as it sped through the busy streets, racing toward the hospital, the only place where hope remained for Amanda and her unborn child. The ambulance raced through the streets of Chicago, its sirens piercing through the night. Jake sat beside Amanda, holding her hand tightly, He could feel her body tensing with each contraction. Her face contorted in pain. Frank sat in the front, his eyes fixed on the road but occasionally glancing back to check on Amanda. "We're just a few minutes away. Amanda, hang in there. We're almost at the hospital," Jake whispered, trying to reassure her, though his own heart was filled with anxiety. Amanda opened her eyes, her breathing rapid and labored. "Jake, I'm so tired," she said weakly, her voice barely audible. She felt as if her body was being worn down by the relentless pain. Jake leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "I know, sweetheart, but you're so strong, you can do this. I'm here, and our baby is waiting for you," he said, fighting back tears. He had never felt more helpless in his life. All he could do was sit beside her, holding her hand, unable to ease the pain she was enduring. Frank glanced back, offering a reassuring smile. "Amanda, you're doing great. We're almost there. Just a little longer, and everything will be okay," he said, his voice calm and full of empathy. The ambulance pulled into the hospital driveway, where the medical team was already waiting at the entrance. The ambulance doors swung open, and a group of doctors and nurses quickly approached. Frank and Lucy lowered the stretcher and worked with the hospital staff to move Amanda inside. Jake walked alongside the stretcher, his eyes never leaving his wife, as they wheeled her through the long hospital corridors. The neon lights cast a pale glow on Amanda's exhausted face. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady but strained. A young doctor, Dr. Harris, approached Jake. "You're Amanda's husband, correct? We'll do everything we can to help her. Please wait in the waiting room, and we'll update you as soon as we know anything." Jake nodded, trying to remain composed. "Please, save her. Her and our baby." His voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Dr. Harris gave him a sympathetic look and nodded before turning back to the medical team. Jake stood there, watching as Amanda was wheeled into the emergency room. He knew this was the moment when everything was out of his hands. He had to trust the people in white coats and hope that everything would be okay. Jake sat in the hospital waiting room, gripping his phone tightly, though he had no intention of using it. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Each time the doors to the emergency room opened, his heart felt like it might leap out of his chest. Meanwhile, what had transpired on the streets of Chicago was spreading rapidly. Bystanders who had witnessed the incident had recorded videos and uploaded them to social media. The footage of Officer Thompson arguing with Frank and even striking his shoulder ignited a wave of outrage in the community. The videos quickly became the center of attention, garnering hundreds of thousands of views and shares. Comments expressing anger at the officer's actions flooded in, demanding justice for Amanda and her family. News headlines began to appear, such as "Police officer blocks ambulance carrying woman in labor," and "Police misconduct endangers family in crisis." Paul, Jake's father, was sitting in his office when his phone rang. Picking it up, he heard the familiar voice of an old friend. "Jack, private investigator." "Paul, have you seen the video? Your daughter-in-law and grandchild were put in danger because of that officer. We have to do something." Paul didn't need much time to think. He knew he couldn't let this go. He had to do everything in his power to ensure that the officer responsible faced the consequences for what he had done to his family. Paul rushed to the hospital as soon as he heard about Amanda's condition. He strode quickly through the brightly lit hospital hallways, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step he took carried a mix of worry and anger. He couldn't accept that his daughter-in-law and unborn grandchild had been put in danger because of one officer's abuse of power. When he reached the waiting room, he saw Jake sitting with his head down, his face weary and full of anxiety. Paul approached and placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Jake, what's going on? How's Amanda?" he asked, his voice warm but unable to hide the tension. Jake looked up at his father, his eyes red and swollen. "Dad, they had to take her into the emergency room. They said her condition is critical. I don't know what to do anymore," he said, his voice trembling as tears streamed down his face. Paul sat down beside his son, gripping Jake's hand tightly. Son, we'll get through this. Amanda will be okay. And so will the baby. I promise you, I won't let anyone hurt our family without consequences, he said firmly, his voice steady, his eyes glinting with determination. Jake looked at his father, feeling a surge of strength from him. He knew Paul wasn't just a father but a powerful lawyer, and he wouldn't rest until justice was served for the pain inflicted on their family. Paul wasted no time reaching out to colleagues and connections within the legal field. He began gathering evidence and arranging for an investigation into Officer Thompson. He wanted to uncover everything about Thompson's past, whether this was his first abuse of power or if there were other victims who had gone unnoticed. Within a day, Jack, the investigator Paul had hired, sent him a detailed report. It outlined numerous incidents involving Thompson, abuse of authority, assault, and even threats against civilians. Most cases had been swept under the rug or dealt with internally without any real consequences. Paul's eyes darkened with anger as he read through the report. He's not just a bad cop, he's a serial abuser of power, Paul thought. It's time he faces the consequences. He quickly assembled his legal team, strategizing to take the case to court. Paul's goal was not only to seek justice for Amanda and Jake, but also to ensure that Thompson could never harm anyone else again. At the hospital, Jake sat beside Amanda, watching her on the hospital bed surrounded by wires and monitors. She was out of critical condition but still very weak. When the doctor informed him that both Amanda and the baby were safe, Jake felt a tremendous weight lift from his chest. However, he knew they had endured a harrowing ordeal. Paul entered the room, his eyes filled with love and determination as he looked at his son and daughter-in-law. Walking over to Amanda's bedside, he gently placed his hand on hers. Amanda, you are the strongest person I've ever known. Don't worry about anything. I'll take care of it all, Paul said, his voice gentle yet resolute. Amanda opened her eyes and gave Paul a faint smile. She knew she had an incredible family and that she would never face these challenges alone. Jake looked at his father, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Dad, he said, his voice choking with emotion. We'll fight this to the end. Paul nodded, his eyes glinting with determination. We'll fight, and we'll win. No one has the right to hurt this family without paying the price. Jake sat beside Amanda's hospital bed, his eyes filled with worry. Medical wires connected her to the surrounding monitors, the steady but faint beeping of her heartbeat echoing through the room. Amanda lay motionless, her eyes closed and her lips pale, as if all her strength had left her. Light filtered through the window, casting a somber yet hopeful glow over the room. Jake gently held Amanda's hand, squeezing it softly. Amanda, you have to stay strong. You have to fight for our baby, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Bowing his head, he rested his forehead on her hand, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In this moment of vulnerability, Jake felt utterly powerless. All he could do was wait. He knew the medical team was doing everything possible to keep Amanda and the baby safe, but the waiting made every second feel like an eternity. Each passing moment was a storm raging within him, twisting his heart with anxiety. The door opened, and Dr. Harris stepped in, clad in a white lab coat. His face bore a look of seriousness mixed with the exhaustion of many tense hours. He approached Jake, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Jake, Amanda's condition has stabilized, but I have to admit, we were dealing with a very dangerous situation. The delay in getting to the hospital caused significant stress on both her and the baby, Dr. Harris said, his tone calm yet firm. Jake looked up, his eyes flickering with hope but still clouded with worry. How is our baby? And Amanda? He asked, his voice filled with desperation. Dr. Harris met Jake's gaze and sighed lightly. We had to perform an emergency C-section. Fortunately, both Amanda and the baby are out of immediate danger, but they're still very weak. The baby is in the neonatal intensive care unit. and we'll monitor them closely over the next 24 hours to ensure there are no complications. Jake's tears flowed freely at the news, the heavy weight in his heart easing slightly. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for saving them," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. After hearing the news from Dr. Harris, Paul felt a storm of anger boiling within him. He couldn't sit idly knowing that his daughter-in-law and grandchild were endangered due to the reckless abuse of power by an irresponsible police officer. Paul decided it was time to act, and he would stop at nothing to bring this case to light. He immediately called his legal team and arranged an emergency meeting at his office. Seated around the table were some of the best lawyers, experienced in cases of abuse of power and civil rights violations. "What evidence do we have so far?" Paul asked, his voice sharp and commanding. He looked around the table, his gaze resting on Linda, a young but passionate attorney. "We have video footage taken by bystanders," Linda said firmly. "It clearly shows Thompson blocking the ambulance, assaulting the EMT, and threatening Jake. This is undeniable evidence. We've also collected witness statements, including testimonies from the paramedics, Frank and Lucy." Paul nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "We're not just suing him for this incident. We need to dig deeper into his past cases. I want to know if he has a criminal record or a history of misconduct that's been covered up." Linda glanced at the file in front of her and nodded. "We've uncovered several complaints against Thompson for abuse of power. Most of them were dismissed or handled internally, but we'll use every one of them to strengthen our case." Paul clenched his fists, his voice low but resolute. "I want to ensure this officer never has the chance to harm anyone again. And not just him. Everyone who has enabled or covered for him will be held accountable as well." The following day, Paul convened another meeting with his legal team, this time inviting journalists from major newspapers. He understood that the power of the media could help bring the case to light and ensure the public was aware of the injustice Amanda had endured. Linda stepped up to the podium, holding several documents and addressing the reporters. "We are here today to announce that we will be filing a lawsuit against Officer Robert Thompson for abuse of power, endangering the life of a pregnant woman and her unborn child." The reporters quickly snapped photos and recorded Linda's statement. Paul stood behind the podium, listening intently to every word she spoke. He knew that every detail mattered, and he was determined to ensure this case would not be ignored. Linda continued, her voice resolute and commanding. "We have clear evidence, including videos from eyewitnesses and statements from those present at the scene. Thompson's actions not only violated the law but also put the patient's life in severe danger. We are demanding justice for Amanda and her family." Paul nodded in approval as he observed Linda's determination. He was confident that his team was well prepared and that they would ensure Thompson could not escape accountability. The day of the first trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the hallways, cameras and recording equipment poised to capture every moment. The community was well aware of the case, and many had come to support Amanda's family. Outside the courthouse, signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Amanda" and "End Abuse of Power" were held high by demonstrators. Thompson sat at the defendant's table, his expression rigid and cold. Dressed in a black suit, he appeared small and out of place compared to the imposing figure he had been when blocking the ambulance. Beside him was his defense attorney, Jeff, a seasoned lawyer familiar with such cases but clearly aware that this one posed a significant challenge. Paul and his legal team sat across the room. Linda rose to begin the proceedings, her voice strong and decisive. "We are here today to address the violations committed by Officer Robert Thompson. He abused his power, not only obstructing an ambulance but also assaulting a paramedic and endangering the life of a pregnant woman." The jury listened intently as Linda presented the evidence. Videos from the scene were displayed on a large screen, clearly showing Thompson striking Frank and blocking the ambulance. Images of Amanda writhing in pain and Jake desperately pleading for help created a tense and emotional atmosphere in the courtroom. Jeff stood to defend his client, Officer Thompson was simply performing his duty. He did not intend to cause harm but was acting to ensure public safety, he argued. But his words lacked conviction and failed to sway the audience. Linda stepped forward, her tone sharp and cutting. You claim it was simply his duty? Was it part of his duty to block an ambulance rushing to the hospital, assault a paramedic, and place a pregnant woman's life in jeopardy? She turned to the jury, her eyes blazing with indignation. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Linda's words palpable. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions serious and contemplative. Paul sat at the lawyer's table, watching Linda with pride. He knew they were on the right path and that justice would prevail. He glanced over at Jake, seated with Amanda in the gallery. Jake held Amanda's hand tightly, his eyes filled with hope and determination. The trial continued, with more evidence brought forward. Testimonies from Frank, Lucy, and witnesses from that day painted a clear picture of Thompson's abuse of power and inhumanity. Justice was drawing nearer, and no one could deny its inevitability. The trial continued with testimony from multiple witnesses. Linda stood, her voice firm as she called the next witness to the stand. I'd like to call Officer Daniels, one of the police officers who arrived at the scene on the day of the incident, she announced, her eyes unwavering as they locked onto the jury. Daniels stepped up to the stand, dressed neatly in his police uniform. He was one of the officers who had witnessed the entire event when Thompson obstructed the ambulance. Daniels looked around the courtroom, his expression tense yet resolute. Officer Daniels, could you tell us what you witnessed when you arrived at the scene? Linda asked, her tone steady but commanding. Daniels took a deep breath, his voice clear and confident. When I arrived, I saw the ambulance blocked by Officer Thompson's vehicle. I witnessed Thompson threatening the medical personnel and even striking EMT Frank. The situation was tense, and there was no valid reason for obstructing that ambulance. It was a clear violation of protocol and completely unnecessary. Linda nodded, thanking Daniels, turning to the jury, her voice sharpened with conviction. Here we have another police officer who witnessed the incident and is willing to testify. This isn't just the word of medical staff or the victim's family. It's corroborated by the accused's own colleagues. Jeff, Thompson's defense attorney, rose and approached Daniels, attempting to undermine his credibility. Officer Daniels, isn't it possible that you misunderstood the situation? Thompson may have simply been trying to do his job, Jeff suggested, his tone feigning reasonableness. Daniels shook his head, his gaze fixed on Jeff. No, I don't believe there was any misunderstanding. Thompson's actions were unjustifiable, and calling it doing his duty is no excuse. When an ambulance is en route to the hospital with a patient in critical condition, obstructing it is unacceptable behavior. Jeff paused briefly before returning to his seat, unable to counter Daniels's clear and decisive testimony. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes now turning to Thompson. His face began to show signs of discomfort and anxiety, the confidence he once carried visibly unraveling. During the trial, Amanda was gradually recovering. She could now sit up and had begun walking around her hospital room with Jake's assistance. Their baby boy, still in the neonatal intensive care unit, was showing positive signs of improvement. Each day, Amanda and Jake visited the NICU, gazing at their tiny son with eyes full of love and hope. Amanda knew Jake had been by her side through the most difficult days, and now, she wanted to show the same strength and stand beside him during the trial. One day, when Linda visited the hospital to provide an update on the case, Amanda made her decision clear. Linda, I want to testify. I want to stand in court and tell my story, Amanda said, her eyes shining with determination. Linda looked at Amanda, hesitation written across her face. Amanda, you're still recovering. I don't want you to endure additional stress. You and your baby need care and rest. Amanda reached out and took Linda's hand, gripping it firmly. But this is something I have to do, not just for me and my son, but for others. I want to ensure that Thompson can never harm anyone the way he harmed us." After a moment of thought, Linda nodded. She understood Amanda's resolve and knew her testimony could deliver a powerful blow to Thompson's defense. "All right, Amanda, I'll prepare you for this. But you have to promise me that if it gets to be too much, we'll stop immediately." Amanda smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Linda. I promise." The next day, Amanda appeared in court, seated in a wheelchair with Jake by her side. All eyes in the courtroom turned toward her, and even Thompson couldn't hide his discomfort. His eyes revealed a flicker of panic as he saw Amanda courageously face him. Linda rose, her voice resolute as she called Amanda to the stand. "I'd like to call Mrs. Amanda to testify." Jake gently wheeled Amanda to the witness stand. He looked at her with eyes full of love and encouragement. Amanda took a deep breath, then slowly turned to Linda, her eyes glowing with determination. Linda approached, her tone softer now. "Amanda, could you please tell the jury what happened on that day?" Amanda nodded, her voice slightly trembling but filled with resolve. "That day, I was at home with Jake when the contractions started. We knew it was time, and Jake called for an ambulance. Everything happened so quickly, and the pain was constant. All I could think about was getting to the hospital as fast as possible to ensure my baby's safety." She paused briefly, steadying herself as she recounted the terrifying events. "But on the way to the hospital, the ambulance was stopped by Officer Thompson. He wouldn't let us pass. I could hear Jake and Frank trying to reason with him, but he refused to listen. The pain kept getting worse, and I was so scared. I was terrified I would lose my baby." Jake sat in the audience, his eyes welling up as he listened to his wife's testimony. Linda nodded, thanking Amanda, then turned to the jury. "Amanda's words are the clearest evidence of the serious consequences caused by the defendant's actions. She and her baby were put in danger because of one reckless and abusive decision." The courtroom fell silent, save for a few quiet sobs from the audience. Thompson sat motionless, his eyes avoiding Amanda. He knew that her testimony had laid bare his inhumanity for all to see. After all the witnesses had testified and the evidence was presented, the trial entered the deliberation phase. The jury left the courtroom to discuss the case. Leaving everyone waiting anxiously, Amanda and Jake sat together, his hand tightly holding hers, both hoping that justice would prevail. After several hours, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent as the judge invited the jury's foreperson to stand. "We have reached a verdict," the foreperson said, her voice clear but solemn. "In the case of the People versus Officer Robert Thompson, we find the defendant guilty on all counts: obstruction of medical rescue, assaulting medical personnel, and abuse of power." A collective sigh of relief echoed from Amanda's family. Jake hugged his wife, tears streaming down his face, while Paul smiled softly in satisfaction. Knowing justice had been served, the judge turned to Thompson, his gaze stern. "Officer Robert Thompson, you have been found guilty and will face the consequences. Your actions not only broke the law but also betrayed the community's trust in those tasked with protecting them. I hereby sentence you to 10 years in prison. Upon release, you will be permanently barred from serving in law enforcement." Thompson bowed his head, his face pale as he listened to the sentence. The judge's words were like a hammer pounding the final nail into his career and his life. He knew his life as he had known it was over, beyond redemption. The courtroom erupted into applause and words of praise for Linda, Paul, and the legal team who had fought tirelessly. Amanda sat quietly, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief and hope for her and her family's future. After the trial, Paul approached Jake and Amanda. He bent down, kissing his daughter-in-law on the forehead, his voice warm and emotional. "We did it. All of this was for you and the baby. Now, rest and take care of your little family." Amanda smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for everything," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Jake clasped his father's hand. his eyes shining with trust and appreciation. "You helped us through it all. I don't know how to thank you enough, except to say, thank you." Paul nodded, his eyes glowing with happiness. "No thanks are needed, son. We're family, and family always takes care of each other." Through relentless effort, justice had finally been served. Amanda and Jake, with the support of their family and friends, had overcome their struggles and could now look to the future with faith and hope.